Welcome to this event. This is fantastic. This is called Picture This, a celebration of children's illustration. We'll talk about what that means, children's illustration. We could unpick that for the next 4 hours, I think, but we'll certainly touch on it. My name is Oslo Davis. I'm an illustrator and cartoonist, and I'll be your host for tonight. And then at the end, I'll tell you about a new prize for children's illustration, which is being announced tonight, which is pretty amazing. But first, let me respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here tonight. So let's get into it. Anyone who's spent hours reading with kids will know that drawing for children is no mean feat. Children are fussy. They can be merciless with their selections. They can choose the daggiest, most un-PC of books and snub their nose at a national bestseller. My wife and I have two lovely daughters, and over the last 10 years we've curated this amazing collection of books for our kids. And they're quite sophisticated now in things, art and literature, even though they're only 7 and 9. But unfortunately, one of my daughters always brings out this terrible Barbie collection book of stories. I don't know who gave it to her, and we certainly didn't. And you know, it goes out with hard rubbish, but somehow mysteriously comes back. And I just wanted to say some of the names of the characters in this book: Liana, Sharina, Merlia, and Xylee with an X. This is what we're not going to be talking about tonight, because we have some experts in the field to set us right and to give us an insight into their lives and skills as picture book illustrators. So let's go with the intros. Sally has over 50 children's books published, many of them award-winning, including 2 novels for young adults. Sally's most recent book includes the Billy B. Brown and Hey Jack series and the critically acclaimed children's novel Angel Creek. Sally is, of course, an accomplished illustrator as well, and we'll see some of her work in a moment. Marc in the middle, Marc Martin, is an illustrator, artist and bookmaker, and is the creator of a number of picture books in recent times, including A Forest, Silent Observer, Max, and most recently A River. And Jane Tanner is an author and illustrator who's been creating picture books for over 30 years. Jane's award-winning books include There's a Sea in My Bedroom, Drac and the Gremlin, The Wolf, Playmates, and Isabella's Secret. So please welcome our guests. Jane, I wanted to kick things off with you and to explore your background a bit, because you trained as a fine artist and you practiced as an artist and printmaker for many years before taking up picture book illustration. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to draw for kids.
I fell into it by accident. When I was studying painting at the National Gallery School, the word illustrative was an insult. If you did a painting that was illustrative, you were told it was literal, it was readable, and it was very limited. But I secretly loved Andrew Wyeth, who I saw as a terrific artist and a storyteller at the same time.
The American painter.
The American painter, yes. And what happened was that as a single parent, I was looking for a job I could do from home, and a friend said, why don't you just take some of your pictures to a publisher and see if you can do some readers. So I sort of was a bit sneaky. I was embarrassed to tell my friends that I was doing it, all my fine artist friends, but I found that I really enjoyed the storytelling side. And then there was a particular picture that I did for a reading scheme called Time for a Rhyme, and there was a picture there that I had an uncle who'd never been to an art exhibition. It was a picture of a little mouse on a windowsill, and my uncle cried about this particular picture, and he said, I know how that mouse feels.
Wow.
So then I thought, oh, how can I do better than to touch people's hearts like that?
Yeah,
That's
wow.
why I decided to go on and continue illustrating.
And what age were you when all this started to happen?
Probably mid-30s.
Yep.
Yes, and because of that particular experience, I thought this could be, instead of being elite, it could touch so many more people.
But your career has that amazing power to touch people. Almost all of your books have some kind of raw emotional power. It's quite amazing that you've sustained that for so long.
Well, thank you for that. It's actually, I guess, the deepest part of me wants to be able to reach people. And I think it's because of that story I just told. And whatever drawing I do, I feel I need to enter into the character I'm drawing and feel with that character what's happening. And now and then, I think my work's inconsistent. I think every book I do has got 2 or 3 good pictures in each book. But when they're good, I know they are, and they really do touch me, and I get so excited that they might be able to do that for others as well.
Is that because you run out of time with the other pictures?
I think, yes, I'm always working to a deadline.
I know that's the case with me.
Yes, because I'm working to a deadline. I'd probably take years to do one book otherwise, to get it all perfect. So probably it's good for me to have to keep moving.
Yep.
Yeah.
We might talk about that later. I have some questions about that because I think it's fascinating what artists think of their own work and how they view it. But thanks for that. Marc, your work is vastly different, I would say, to Jane's.
Sure.
But equally...
What do you mean by that?
No, but in the sense that... explain it yourself. What is your background? How have you come to illustrating picture books yourself?
Yeah, my background's... I've sort of come to picture books in a roundabout kind of way, where my background is in graphic design. It's funny when I'm illustrating picture books, I'm kind of constantly trying to, in some ways, unlearn what I've learnt at design school. And it's more recently I've started to think of myself as more of an artist, and the work that I do, I'm trying to take this kind of painterly approach that you're talking about, Jane. So my background's kind of graphic design, so it's really kind of formalist, I guess.
What do you mean by unlearn something from graphic design that's probably not useful?
I guess at design school you're learning about design principles, and there's a real structure to the way that you might compose an illustration or just like lay out a page. And with illustration, I find that the books that I'm drawn to the most are the books that I guess are a lot freer in their aesthetic and the ideas behind them.
Yep. And how do you feel about your journey along that sort of road to freedom?
It's been a funny one because my first book, A Forest, is probably the book that's most like my most recent book, A River. So it's kind of been a circular drawing, and maybe you'll see with the slides later on. And in between that, there's been a lot of work that has been influenced by my graphic design background. So I've tried to combine sort of the computer side of things, because when you're working as a designer, you're kind of on the computer a lot. So I tried to combine that with some of the more kind of hand-drawn elements from A Forest. You'll sort of see with the slides.
Yep. But Sally, you've seemed to... you seem to have been born with a pencil in your hand, started in your teens. When you were a kid you were drawing a lot, but started publishing books at an early age after stints overseas in China and around the place, and learning Chinese brush drawing overseas. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think in the same way as Marc and Jane, I kind of moved into it out of necessity, and like Jane, I was looking for something that I could do at home, that I could contain. So I trained as a fine artist, and a fine artist requires lots of chemicals and big studio and big space and lots of empty headspace in particular, whereas illustration felt like something I could do on the kitchen table while the baby napped. So it did seem to be just a natural progression where I could still paint and draw, and certainly I feel like picture book illustrations are very broad. You know, even if you just compare our styles, they're so completely different. So this felt like a really exciting area to go into, where not only were you able to work on a smaller scale, and I've always been interested in writing too, so accompany the words that I was writing, but also tell the story through the pictures and have the story come out through the design, through not just through the words as well. So it was this kind of mix of storytelling and artwork that I loved. That I guess at school the only two things I was any good at was art and English. So picture books just seemed to be the perfect combination of those two things.
Thanks for that. I'm really interested in this idea of drawing for kids specifically, because we're all fully grown adults. We're not children. We have mature sort of lives and things going on in our lives. And in fact, for people who have no contact with kids, they don't have kids themselves, you know, understanding the mind of a child is probably like understanding the mind of a cat. You know, it's sort of something that's so foreign to them. But you guys have this amazing ability to connect with children. And I'm just wondering where that comes from, because that's a feat all in itself. Jane, what about you? Tell us about that.
I think that authors and illustrators have still got the child in them fully engaged. We all remember being children, and you know, perhaps it was a very intense time for us as well. And so it's not hard to channel those feelings and of actually respecting the child and wanting to offer something that is going to be useful to the child. And I think I remember a quote: "Children are the last of the wild." I think savages or something. But I remember as a child being very confused and worried by a lot of things I didn't understand, and there were no words to explain those feelings. But in picture books, in Alice in Wonderland, Winnie the Pooh, those books, I found some sort of connection that helped me feel someone else understood how I felt. So I remembered that, and I think I've tried to be true to it.
Sally, why children though? I know you're starting to write for young adults. Do you think it's something you might do to write for adults eventually, or are you keen to stay within the world of the child?
It's a good question, because I think a lot of writers, and this isn't a criticism of you, but there are a lot of writers who do battle that question: when are you going to write a serious book? And it is a kind of a bone of contention amongst children's writers. But for me, I think what it is in writing and illustrating for children is it's more like Jane said, it's more just tapping into that child part of yourself. And often when I teach writing, what I'm encouraging my students to do is to see the world as if they were a child. So this is whether you're writing for children or adults. So you know, when you travel, you see things as if for the first time, and all of a sudden you're inspired to jot things down in a journal, or to write letters back home, or sketch a photograph. Well, you've got to learn to see the very roads that you walk down every day in exactly the same way, in that fresh kind of insight. So I guess that's what I think is what the child is within. It is that idea of seeing everything as if for the first time, seeing things with awe. And I think that's where inspiration comes from. So why would you write for adults? When you can tap that creative inner part of yourself. And I do think, like Jane says, I do have a natural affinity with children. I like them, which is kind of handy when you're writing for children. But apparently Roald Dahl didn't, so it's not a prerequisite. But I do have a strong memory of myself as a child, and I think that does help.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably more difficult than to write for adults. To entertain a child, anyone who's spent a rainy Sunday afternoon alone with a 4-year-old, locked in a house and having to entertain them, then if you can do that, then you can rule the world, I think. But I'm interested in this idea of how pictures and picture books seem to weave their magic over kids. Mark, do you want to talk about this in a way?
Weaving their magic.
Because of course, we read to our kids, and kids eventually learn to read and create pictures in their minds. But to present them with pictures and this created world is an interesting thing that does something to kids, and I want to explore that a little bit now, if you
I think, talking about my own work, my own experiences, I rely heavily on really good illustrations mainly because I'm not that. I guess I could almost say I'm not that confident as an author because I've come again from a design background. Authoring a children's book is still something quite foreign to me, and also just jumping on with that idea of what a kid's book is or a children's book. I also kind of have problems just with that terminology. Because for me, I like to think of myself as a picture book creator rather than a children's book creator. And it just so happens that the books that I make appeal to children, but they also appeal to adults.
So you're not creating for a child?
I wouldn't necessarily say that I was, no.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah,
Because I think it's a good mix of the styles that we have here, because I think of your artwork as actually being very sophisticated. And I think picture book is the most similar medium to picture book is probably film, in the way that visuals tell the stories as much as words
Yeah, you're
do.
storyboarding.
And if you look at the composition of Jane's work, it's very sophisticated. There's probably not that much different to what you were doing at art school. You were probably thinking of composition, and the artwork is certainly very, very detailed and very...
Well, I have some variations on that, because I had about 8 years where I didn't illustrate in the middle of my career. And when I came back, I had a young grandchild, and I decided to do a little gift for him. Didn't expect to be going on and doing more and more, but that was a one-off, I thought. But then I explored how does a 2-year-old read a visual image? And I realised a 2-year-old, 2 or 3-year-old, and of course we know that they do the thing that's most important biggest, and the other, the thing least important small. So I thought about perspective, and a very small child isn't going to understand why the thing that's closer is bigger. So avoid perspective. Another thing would be don't do a close-up for a 2-year-old, because they wonder where the rest of the figure is. So, when a child draws, they draw the whole figure. So for me, there were so many things about, if I'm working for that age group, how would that age group perceive visual imagery?
How did you learn this?
Well, I suppose I did a lot of reading, but also I remembered things like when I gave a talk once with the sea in my bedroom, a little child said, "That boy's got his head chopped off." And I thought, I must remember that. That age group didn't understand. But I think a lot of it has to do with being around small children, looking at their drawings and asking them questions about their work. So I do choose to draw for a certain age group. So when I did The Wolf, of course, I used metaphor, because that was for teenagers. And so I designed larger amounts of text to show that it was more a book that was for someone who could read large blocks of text. So I'm quite conscious of the age group I'm working to.
Well, that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned The Wolf, because you've said that that's one of your most favourite picture books that you've created. But it was put into the young early readers section of the Children's Book Awards, and you felt as though it missed an audience.
Oh, yes.
So I'm interested now about this idea of pictures that can shift between ages. Do you want to talk about The Wolf a little bit and why it is for older readers?
Oh, yes,
What makes it different, for example, for
well, it was
for
the
younger
first
readers?
time I'd been given a text where if you drew literally what was in the words, you would take away all of the drama and also the abstract sort of the layers that were in it. So my job was to do things like, when the text said that they were contained within the house, my job was not to draw the interior of the house, because it symbolised that their lives were being contained and narrowed down. So I had the real difficulty of not being able to draw fabulous surreal drawings, but instead just a close-up that showed emotion. All of that meant that I was really conscious of how the picture was going to be read without giving away or without misinterpreting the subtext. So it was the first book of its type, I think, and no one knew quite what to do with it, so it just disappeared.
It came out in 1991.
Yes,
1990,
yes.
and
It
was
didn't. No one knew
nominated
what
for
to do with
an
it.
award.
And I actually think giving it to very young children as a junior book was a terrible mistake, because not only did they not understand metaphor at that age, as I said, I'm vigilant about age group, but also it was a bit scary. Also, and last of all, like older children are able to live with an abstract sort of unfinished story where you're left to make up the final resolution for yourself, whereas little ones need a very strong black and white finished sort of story where they know how it all ends up. So it was a really bad thing to give it to young children.
Yeah. Sally, do you start out thinking you're creating something for an early reader, an older reader, a young adult, or even drawing? Let's talk about drawing, and find that it shifts into different age groups, or do you have a pretty clear picture when you're starting out?
Well, writing very much so. I very much have my readership in mind, but more and more when I'm illustrating for other writers. So I guess the thing about the picture book category is, I think, is illustrated really well here, and what Jane and Marc are saying is that it's become a broader and broader category, and this is with the introduction of the graphic novel and picture books for older readers. Absolutely. And that kind of thing. They're really, it is can be quite a sophisticated text. But when I'm the illustrator for somebody else's text, I see the initial words as just the basic framework, and I see my responsibility, like Jane was saying, is not just illustrating what's in the words, but creating another world from that initial scaffold. So I'm not going to just illustrate what's actually, because I guess like the old style illustrated picture books, like if we're thinking Enid Blyton, it literally was what was in the words, whereas now I think picture books are really opening up a whole new spectrum of what can be understood by the pictures, and children are developing visual literacy, and a lot of high schools are teaching picture books as well and using them to explain some quite difficult concepts. I mean, a lot of the stuff that Margaret Wilde and Ansbert Willis do is quite sophisticated, and so I think certainly when I illustrate for other people, it depends on the text, and then I will try to bring my own vision to it so that I'm in fact enhancing it, not just sitting alongside it. That's my goal anyway. Can you give an example of your work? Like, I'm thinking the Rainbirds in my head, but are there other ones? That's a good example, because David Metzen is quite a sophisticated writer, and I knew this was going to be for quite a young readership, so I felt like it was my job to connect with the child. So the words are quite literary, they're quite lyrical, but I needed to find something that children could connect with. So I developed my own themes, like themes of the seasons changing, the theme of the music of the magpies, even the father-son relationship. And then I wanted to represent the city, and the nature has been quite different. So the city is just black and white and red and just cut out newspaper, whereas nature is very painterly and very lush and very green. So all these decisions are being made by illustrators, and how much of it is actually absorbed by the viewer, it's difficult to know. But it certainly is something that I think can be much more sophisticated than we give it credit for, that there is a lot of thought that goes in behind every picture. Thanks for that. I'm interested now about this idea of coming up with ideas, and I read something that Quentin Blake wrote recently in one of his great big art books that he's been putting out recently. He said that he can come up with a picture book idea very easily, but it's very difficult to come up with an idea that stands the test of time, which is pretty interesting for him to say, because I think almost all of his work stands the test of time. But what about you guys? Marc, what about you? Do you have trouble, like you've just finished a book, A River. I imagine you're probably starting to think or already down that path of thinking about what's next. Is it easy for you to come up with ideas, and how does it happen for you?
Yeah, good question. Ideas usually come with having time and space to let those ideas come naturally. It's funny too when you're working on a book, you'll sort of be immersed in that world for months on end, and sometimes I find it really difficult to sort of to have the headspace to work on other things, and that's something I'm kind of just learning as I go, is to kind of give myself the space to allow other ideas to come to me, I guess.
But how does it happen in the sense of do you have a sketchbook? Do you spend time in a cafe? Do you go on a holiday? I just kind of loll around cafes all the time. Well, it's funny because again, coming from a graphic design and a commercial illustration background, where the timelines are
if you're doing an editorial illustration, you might have to turn something around in 2 or 3 days, compared to a picture book, which could be 2 to 3 years, where you'll approach a publisher. So say I have an idea in 2015, I approach a publisher, I do some sketches, they okay that, and then there's a whole long process. I turn in the finished art, and then they try and work out where that book is going to fit in with their schedule. That's 3 years. That's a really long time to be sort of stuck on one idea. So yeah, it's important to have other ideas on the go at the same time.
Is that because you could get bored if you were doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely happened with me in the past where.
And broke.
Yeah, and broke. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
What about you, Jane? So you've created books with other people, but I'm talking now specifically about your own authored books. Coming up with ideas for those, you mentioned earlier that you thought it would be nice to help or inform children about some angst or problems that, in their lives, or just to entertain. Is that how it starts with you? Do you think, I'd love to write a book for this specific person or my grandchild or something?
Well, I actually think I was a better illustrator when I was working with authors, because then I had a story that already worked. And it was up to me to add and stretch and grow and take it to another dimension. My problem is, I think, visually, and so my text is a bit wooden. I think it could be a bit wooden. I think my text could be much braver and much more adventurous, except I'm so desperate to get to the pictures. I don't really put enough time into I mean, I should. I try. But it's interesting, really. I don't know how you manage, Mark, because it seems to me to come up with the ideas and the words and the pictures all at once is a real challenge.
Yeah, well, actually, I kind of think my text is a bit wooden too.
I just illustrate for other people.
Well, the thing is, I don't think I could illustrate for other people. I'd probably get too frustrated with their ideas and kind of, I don't know.
I can't stand it.
Yeah.
The trouble with working with an author is I've become a diva now. Once or twice I've done something with an author and I've had them put in writing that they're going to leave me alone. Because there's nothing worse than having somebody leaning over your shoulder, interpreting for you. Even if the work is well enough written, it should be standalone, and you should be able to be left to do your own interpretation.
The other thing too is because I come from a commercial background where I'm working with clients, and I've had that experience of always having to compromise with illustrations. So to finally have something where I can write the text and illustrate that text is just so liberating that I just couldn't stand the idea of working, illustrating someone else's text.
But Jane, do you think the writers consider that there will be pictures for their words? Like, I sometimes feel as though that they are just so focused on getting the words right. And there's possibly no consideration in their minds that illustrations will take it to another level.
It's pressing a red button for me, of course, because it's a major issue for me. The best picture books, in my opinion, we'll go back to what Ted Greenwood said years ago, the best picture books don't work on the radio. And that's a really important point. It's different from an illustrated text. A picture book relies on the pictures. A child should be able to turn the pages and get a general understanding of the book from the pictures even before the text comes along. But it seems to me there are lots of people who write wonderful novels, terrific novels, but they find it very hard to pull themselves back and let the pictures do the work. And so what happens is they write words that are full of wonderful imagery, but they don't want you to change the imagery. They want that imagery to be in the words, and you should decorate it. But that stops you from taking it as far as it should go.
I think you have to be a very generous writer. Being a picture book writer, you have to have a lot of trust and let go of a lot of ego, because text is really just the basic framework that allows the pictures to grow.
Have trust. Yes.
And so I think some of the best collaborations have been either working with a really good editor, and that's really the editor's job, is to be the go-between and make sure that never the twain shall meet, or otherwise a really great collaboration. And later when we show our picture books, I'll show a really great collaboration where the author and illustrator, and it's very uncommon, but they did talk and they did agree to cut quite a lot of the text out because the pictures already told the story.
And that's wonderful when you work with someone like that,
Yeah,
who
that's a real
actually
gift.
says, you do it and I'm prepared to pull back if I need to let you do that. But I've had a couple of major cancellations in my life where there's been a clash of titans.
Tell us about them.
Some
Tell us
gossip.
about these books that were never made. Or they went somewhere else, did
There's
they?
3 in my life, actually.
Can you talk about them?
I can if I don't mention the names of the people involved.
Go for it.
Right, okay. Let me see how I can do this without any litigation.
But maybe just tell us about the nature of the conflict, or why.
Yes.
Why?
Okay.
What,
nature
what was
of
it
the
all about?
conflict.
Yeah.
There was somebody who, a very famous author, who went through 4 different illustrators to get a particular book out. He was a terrific writer, and it was a marvellous piece of text, but he couldn't let go of controlling what pictures came. And as I had a studio in the front room of my house, and he lived walking distance.
Nightmare. He just thought he'd pop in all the time.
Every day. Every day.
Really?
And he would tap on the glass window of where I was working and peer through the glass to see what I was doing. And then, of course, I'd ask him in and he'd want to supervise. And after about a year, my publisher said to me, keep working, don't give up on this. But after a year, I banned him from the studio. And it was the best work I'd probably done in 20 years.
But it's...
And because I banned him from the studio, he cancelled the book.
God, Paul Jennings is so creepy.
Wasn't Paul?
Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Wasn't Paul. This person has since passed on, thank goodness. But this person went through 4 of the best illustrators in the country.
Wow.
And he, years later, would revisit it as the failure of the illustrators.
Whoa.
Often on the radio. It actually caused me a breakdown. It stopped me working for 8 years because it was my best work. And this man just couldn't leave it alone. And it would have been a terrific book.
Well, let's have a look at some of your work now. I think the slideshow is going to, it's ready to go. So we'll do it very quickly because we haven't got a lot of time, but I'm going to click it through and we'll have a look at some of this work that you've done, Jane. Just 5 slides. I asked our panellists to bring along some work that they thought was indicative of the history of their career so far. From oldest to newest. So talk us through this, Jane.
Remember I said that I did Time for Rhyme was a big reader that where I discovered that I wanted to be an illustrator. And this was one of the first pictures. It was the first one I did, and that's when I discovered about time. It took me 3 months to draw this. And then I think I had about a week and a half to do the other 3 pictures. So I learned a lot about managing my time. This is the first text that Margaret Wilde wrote, and my first picture book. And what I discovered from this was the subtext of the story. Apart from being literal about the content of the story, I thought, what's this really about? And asking myself that question, I thought, it's about a child going from dry to wet. So I must put the tactile things into the picture. So it's not just about his imagination, but it's about him going from the thing he's afraid of, where he won't let it touch him, to being surrounded by it and enjoying it.
Can you remind us the name of that book?
That was called There's a Sea in My Bedroom.
That's right.
It's been out for many, many years. Still in print, I think.
And this is from The Wolf.
This is from The Wolf. This was a very important picture to me. It was, I said, it was the first one in the book, and it was about metaphor. I literally took all the decoration out of the room, left the boards bare, made sure the child looked restless. This was the first time I drew body language and symbolism. And I did little things like making sure the spider's web curtain was blowing in the wind to show that the window must be open So if you're really afraid, why would you leave the window open? So that was a really important one for me. Everything there was symbolic, and I think I learned a lot about how to tell a story in a very minimal way as well.
And the cat can see something we can't.
The cat can see. The cat is restless. And if the child was really frightened, would he have his toes sticking out? This is almost a homage or something to Alice in Wonderland. It's when I decided I wasn't allowed fairy books as a child. They were considered frivolous. And I really was brought up on a sort of a diet of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. And so for me it was being rebellious and particularly subversive to draw fairies, which are considered crass and sentimental. But I was hoping to be drawing something about a scale, about a child, you know, who's had an imagination where things being really, really little or getting right up close to something, I could play with the scale. And
I understand you made models for this. Is that
I did.
right?
I always, yes, if I'm working on something three-dimensional, well, I need to get the lighting right. I'll make models and work with the torch. Yes.
And the last one here was from a book that came out last year.
Yes, well, I worked with a wonderful author who was very generous, and also my designer at Penguin. And this is I thought this was a summation of a lot of things I've learned, because it's got the body language. This is my grandson looking out off into the distance. And, you know, I'm using body language, I'm using the light coming into the darkness to touch on the edges of things. If you can see, he's looking down the road with the suggestion of where he's going. So I think this is bringing together a lot of the things I've learned as an illustrator.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful.
Let's give Jane a round of applause for that. That's The Soldier's Gift, isn't it? Anzac's story.
Yes.
We're going to zip through this. We'll have a look at yours now, Mark.
Sure.
So, tell us a little bit about these.
This is a forest. This is the front cover of a forest. Yeah, this is the first picture book that I made, and I initially I self-published it. I do have a copy of it here. So it was just as a soft cover paperback. Yeah, and it's like I was saying before. It's really it's quite similar to my latest book, A River, in the style of artwork, and you'll sort of see with the next slide. This is the kind of artwork that I was doing. Well, this was done in 2010 at the time, so this is after a forest. So it's more kind of computer-based, and I guess there's a brief in mind. But yeah, so if you have a look at the next slide, after I made a forest, Penguin, because I self-published that, that was kind of, I was distributing that book myself. So I was kind of looking at other ways of promoting myself, and so I came up with this concept to do this exotic animals book, which was also self-published in like a tiny little version, and then Penguin eventually noticed what I was doing and decided to republish it in a larger format. But they also, at that point, noticed a forest and were like, "Oh, we've been meaning to contact you for 3 years to publish a forest, so let's do that as well." And probably wasn't until this point where I kind of realised that maybe it was time to start exploring other ways of illustrating, and becoming comfortable with drawing by hand. Even though I'd already done a forest, that wasn't really, I guess, a way of supporting myself in terms of making money. So after that, I kind of started exploring using hand-drawn elements in my commercial illustration work. So this is something I did last year. It's the cover for a reissue of the Jungle Book. So yeah, it's just a really great opportunity to sort of work with a great author. And then this is my latest book, A River. So you can sort of see the lineage there, where I've kind of I was kind of referencing all my kind of graphic design knowledge, but then kind of trying to move away from that and kind of just go back to where I started and just kind of have fun and sort of be free and expressive.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Please give him a round of applause. Sally.
Do you remember what I I put up there now?
Go for it.
So that was the very first picture book I wrote and illustrated on my kitchen table when I was about 24 or something. And I'd just come back from China and I'd been studying traditional Chinese painting. So I wanted a book for the Chinese Australian children that I was tutoring that reflected their lives in Melbourne. So I had to write it because there weren't any around, and used a traditional Chinese brush technique for the outline and then coloured it up with watercolour. Often the text would dictate the medium that I use as well. So this is one that I illustrated for Valanga Koza, who's a South African musician and storyteller. So I spend a long time researching traditional African design and house, the way that houses are painted. So not as in block painted, but houses are decorated in rural South Africa, and used a design that kind of reflected that. So this was a different style for me. This is probably a mix of all my favourite mediums, so there's a little bit of Chinese brush stroke there. This was a book set in Japan, so I used some Japanese rice paper. So I think that the techniques that I love using the most are probably collage and brush and ink, because they're both quite expressive in different ways. This one's a little bit harder to see. Once again, this was the text that dictated the illustrations that I could do about the life of Siddhartha. So often I'll begin, when I get a new manuscript, just wandering through an art store and splurging, buying beautiful materials. And this whole book was just based around these gorgeous coloured rice papers that I bought. And so it was just an excuse to work within that colour scheme. So this was... I'm
going to jump in and say I'm interested in the fact that you change your style or media when you're approaching a new project. That's pretty interesting.
Well, that keeps it interesting for me. And just to give a really quick anecdote for this one I got really stuck on, because apparently Buddha can only be represented in certain ways. And so I was getting very anxious when the publisher was saying, oh, we might, upset some people who are Buddhist when they look at this, his face has to be certain proportions. So I emailed the writer who lives in New Orleans, and she'd done a biography on the Dalai Lama, and she said, oh, just send me the JPEGs, we'll send them off to the Dalai Lama and he can check them. So, my God, that's like texting God.
Did he provide a blurb on the book?
Yeah, and he did an endorsement for the book. Yeah, so Dalai Lama said it was all right. And then once again, you can see how the text dictates the style that I use. So this was a traditional Chinese brushstroke, but I worked quite closely with the designer, and she scanned in some old Chinese rubbings on rock, so carvings of characters into rock that were then done with crayons and rub. That's the texture in the background as she dropped those colours in. And the chops were made myself just out of styrofoam, so not the real thing, the Chinese stamps. Yep. So I did those for each page as well.
You made those yourself?
I did.
Fantastic.
I think that's all I've got to
say.
Yeah,
that's great. Please, thanks, Sally, for those. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. We have time for questions. If you have a question, please put your hand up, and our two roving microphone people will come to you. And we have a question straight away. Great.
Jeff Prentice.
Hello.
Hi, Sally. Hi, Jane. Hi, Mark. I don't know you, but I will get round to see you. I write articles on authors and illustrators of children's books. So it's great to see Jane. And I have a problem, and you people might be able to help me. I've been engaged by the Victorian Artists Society on Eastern Hill, the most wonderful place, the cradle of Australian art. And here I am walking in, Sally and Jane, and I'm the youngest there. And my daughter says I'm over the hill. But I need help. I need a change in thinking. Why can't we have children's book illustrations of genre in the place? I have no idea. But if you can help me, I'll come and talk to you. So any thinking, I'll be very grateful. Okay? Good.
What was the question? Why can't we have children's book illustration?
Why can't we have children's book illustration in the place? Why can't we?
In where is this?
Victorian Artists Society.
Right.
In East Melbourne.
Oh, okay.
A wonderful place. I've been given the job of restoring the place before it falls down. But look, any thinking, I would love to hear from you, because if I saw just one exhibition, I'd have some young people in the place, people that know about children's book illustration. It would change the whole atmosphere. Sally, can I get your help?
Sally will personally look into that herself.
I know Sally quite well.
Thanks. Any more questions? Please put your hand up if you do. Okay, there you go.
Beautiful work, guys. It was really enlightening, and we're big fans. The primary question for us is, how do we enlarge our market? Because we're such a small country. How do we push those books? Because they're such high quality and they come and go in a breath. So the light for this week is suddenly on the floor next week. We really need to expand that market. Do you have any thoughts? Thank you.
I read that all book sales last year, 31% were for children. So it's a massive market, at least here. But Sally, you work and teach and have travelled overseas. How do Australian books travel?
I think picture books have always been a little bit problematic because they're expensive to produce, they're expensive to buy. I think that children's books, the ones that you're talking about, which true still apparently are selling quite well, tend to be the more commercial ones or series, ones that are not expensive for people to buy. Picture book is a beautiful work of art, and it tends, I remember Anne James saying, and I don't know if she's in the audience, that the only reason they still exist is because there are enough people passionate about them. And it's a kind of a sad truth, really, that they are such a beautiful art form, that there are just enough people who are passionate about this art form that keep it going. And I think Australia has an incredible reputation overseas due to a lot of our amazing artists here, but it is a unique art form, and it's not particularly commercial. I don't know how to make money from picture books. That's why I turned my hand to writing series for children, because it's very hard to make a living in Australia illustrating picture books. That's the sad truth.
I think things have shifted in the last few years too for publishers as well. To make money, they have to work out that that particular person sells a lot. Yeah. And therefore they'll stay with that person. I notice in bookshops, I sit in bookshops sometimes and listen, and there are still parents who think that a picture book is just a bridge to a real book. And thank goodness there are collectors who believe in beautiful picture books, but there seems to have been a shift even more, I think, in the last few years, that things have to have some purpose, and perhaps it's towards teaching reluctant readers to read, or it's to do with getting them onto something more important.
Yeah, and a lot of the larger publishers sort of don't understand that either, I think. Yeah.
And it is a risk, really, because sometimes a parent who's not necessarily passionate or educated about books for children will pick up a book with lots of pages and lots of words, and a picture book, and the picture book's twice the price. Exactly. And I think, well, I'm not spending money on that. My child will finish that in half an hour. This will take them a day. So there's value for money. So, I guess it's education, and I think a lot of teachers and librarians in high schools are really showing that picture books have a life beyond just
thank goodness for Sean Tan.
That's right.
Sally, you're an advocate for getting kids to read picture books for a long time. My daughter's 9, nearly 10, and her picture book days are almost behind her.
No.
Which is sad, and I would not encourage it. But it seems to be the general kind of osmosis of how things go, I guess. What's your thinking on this?
Well, I think it is thanks to people like Sean Tan that are also merging this area of the graphic novel, which is becoming bigger and bigger in Australia. It's always been huge throughout Asia and Europe. France and Belgium has a really big tradition of graphic novels, and obviously through Asia as well. Yeah. And I think that's the future of the picture book, because then if a child is reading a graphic novel, it's not such a big leap to then go and look at a more sophisticated picture book like Marc's, and to see that they could see that perhaps as watching a short film. And
I still read graphic novels today. Like, for example, there's a guy called Joe Sacco who does these incredible graphic novels about really complex issues, like what's going on in Gaza or Palestine. So there's definitely scope there to explore those issues in picture book format.
And more cartoons in newspapers too.
Yes.
Yes. It's just about not just words being able to tell the story, and not seeing pictures as something infantile, that they are actually quite a sophisticated medium to tell a story.
Well, colouring in is very sophisticated at the moment.
That's the new thing, isn't it?
How can we explain that? I mean, that is pretty amazing. Do you have any thoughts on the colouring in phenomenon, Jane?
I haven't had until this moment. I just avoid them.
Sorry, put you on the spot.
But anything that encourages people to be creative and enjoy themselves is important. And I think there's something about the world has changed since people have started taking photographs with their phones. I think people are more visually literate than they've ever been. I think that also animations, there's a whole world now where visual imagery is much more accessible to people, and And therefore, you know, if there's been a shift to colouring, and perhaps it means people, just like they've learnt to take their own photos more than they used to, they might be feeling they could try a few colours together and see what happens. I think it's quite lovely, really, if I actually analyse it.
Yep.
I just haven't thought too deeply because I haven't wanted one myself. You know?
Well, it's very meditative, isn't it? I don't know about you two, but once I've actually plotted out the illustration and I do get to the bit that's kind of colouring in, it is a much more meditative place to be, and I can often spend hours in my studio and come out and have got so quiet and so introspective that I've almost lost my voice because I go very deep inside myself. And you don't do that with words. Words is very cerebral, very much in your head. Whereas I think there's something about drawing that pulls you down into your body. It's a much calmer place to be.
There's probably, with the colouring in books, there's sort of a link with the slow movement, I guess.
Yeah, and craft, all those kind of things.
And having the confidence, perhaps, because it's got lines around it.
That's right, you have to
be
make
able
it.
to play with colour.
Yeah.
And that's lovely. And so when I've actually started to think about it, it could be a very positive move. Get people.
I'd be surprised. I imagine there's a lot of just empty colouring books sort of sitting on people's coffee tables. They like the idea of, you know...
One page coloured in. Any more questions? One back in the middle. Microphone is coming.
Hi, my name's Henry. I just have two questions maybe. The first is, I hear you talking about graphic novels and comics, and I guess I'd like you to maybe give me your definition of the difference between a graphic novel, a picture book and a comic. And the second relates, personally, my daughter's loved drawing since she was really small, and she's about 10, just going on 11, and she tends to draw in a very caricature sort of way, and that's leading her to doing that sort of almost a cross between graphic novel, because she has this imagination that tells these weird stories, and then illustrating them as well. And I guess I'd just like to know what your definition, and also what advice you would have for someone who's, if they wanted to go in that direction.
I might throw the definition over to Mark.
I'm not really sure. There's such a blurred boundary between them all. I think it's really hard to put a fixed definition on them. In response to your last question, I'd say I just encourage her to just go out and make and do and not worry about what other people think or what the definitions are. I did actually just bring in a book, and this is one of my favourite books, and it's called Pebble Island, and it's by an author called John McNaught, and it's a wordless picture book, and I bought this at the age of like 30, and it appeals to me, but I imagine it also appeals to younger readers. So, and I don't really know if there's any. I mean, I guess it's a graphic novel, but I don't really know if there's any need to really. Differentiate between those three.
Yeah, I don't think it's useful in many ways to create boundaries. What about you, Jane?
It seems to me that everybody has their own vision, and looking at the three different sort of artists' work up on the screen, I've realised it doesn't matter. If you gave each of us the same story to illustrate, we'd each find our own language. And each of us would find particular things that really moved us. So we would have three completely different versions of a wonderful story. So I guess in the end you're true to the way you perceive things and the things that interest you, the techniques that you develop to give voice to those things. There is no specific right or wrong way.
I think that's really happens at the marketing level, those definitions, just so that booksellers know where to place the book, but it isn't often where the creator will start. And as for your daughter, I started exactly the same way, so she'll just probably turn out like me. Sorry.
We probably have time for one last question. Yep, just down here.
Thank you. I'm Lois McVitie. A blast from the past, I suppose, that Walter and I feel that we've been there, done that a long time ago. Lovely to hear Jane up there, and I did identify with your experience of the author who has passed on. But And I do know who you're talking about. Because I knew most of the illustrators who put up with what you did. But my question is for the three, and I would like to know, what is your favourite picture book?
Well, it's a great question, because I did ask our panellists to bring in a book that possibly wasn't their favourite, but maybe something that they wanted to talk about and it was of note and importance to them. So have we already seen yours, Mark?
Kinda, yeah.
Okay, well, Jane, we'll throw it over to you.
Well, I bought half a dozen, but I left them in the back room. It's very hard to pick a favourite. But after looking at the ones that I really love, and they're all the famous ones, where the wild things are, you know, going on a bear hunt, there's so many wonderful books to choose. But I bought, my most favourite book at the moment is How to Heal a Broken Wing. Anything Bob Graham touches is magic. He's a humanist, he's got such a tender heart, he loves people. But what I wanted to talk about is how he tells the story, because even before you get the title, you've got the story begun. And what he's managed to do with this wonderful book is find times when there isn't even a page of text, there's just, I can just find it for you. You have highlights of special moments, like here we have a crowded sort of city scene all in grey, lots of things going on, and a little bright moment where the little boy finds this wounded bird. And what I love about this is that he dares to have long silences in the book. I just found one other picture that I just really love. You know, even this one here where the family are gathered tenderly in the light of the television. Bob Graham manages to not only be a humanist, but he knows how to tell the story in a sort of almost a cinematic way, and then to stop and get you to pause and just feel the moment. So I think that's
funny looking at some of those pages too. The form that is used, it's almost like a comic book, isn't it?
Yes,
so it's whether you want to call that a picture book or a graphic novel, or
it's a good example of that crossover.
We're really running out of time, so Sally, can we give your...
Couldn't choose a favourite one. I just chose this one because this is a good example of a really successful collaboration between Libby Gleeson and Armand Grieder, who work well together.
Wonderful.
And the reason why I chose this one is because Armand was generous enough to say Libby was generous enough to say that Armand's illustrations told the story enough, and she actually dropped the text from halfway through right to the end of the story. So at the very beginning of the story, you see it told from the perspective of the bear, and you see the bear walking behind the village people. And then there is a moment where you're not quite sure what happens, but you're meant to read through the text where it looks like the bear has left his body and he moves out of the body and goes up into the sky. So it really, to me, is a perfect example of the way that the illustrations tell the story, and so much more than the text could. And as Libby very generously says, she realised that the text was just going to hold it to this one idea, whereas the illustrations can expand on that idea in so many ways. So I teach this book quite a lot because I think it's a great example of how you can't have this book without the illustrations, the non-radio book. I think it's a really good quote.
And the silent moments, where you just
moments,
pause and just engage with the picture. Yeah.
All right, thanks so much. Please thank our three guests, Jane, Mark and Sally.
Thank you.